All right, everybody, welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Arthur. I'm a member of the Emergency Committee for Rojava, and I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We have a very special event with our friend Meghan Bodette of the Kurdish Peace Institute, who's actually joining us from on the ground in Kurdistan. And the theme of today's event, as you've probably already seen, is what's next for Rojava and the Kurdish freedom movement. There's been a tremendous amount of changes, of major developments in the last months, particularly since the fall of Assad last December. And so we're really bringing intention with this event to get us all kind of up to speed on all these major shifts in the kind of balance of political and military forces in Syria, in Turkey, in northern Iraq, and to really kind of dig into this question of what does that mean for the future of the Kurdish freedom movement. Um, I want to say, first of all, that for those unfamiliar with the Emergency Committee for Rojava, we are a group focused on raising kind of public awareness and support for the Rojava Revolution, as well as the broader Kurdish freedom movement. If you want more information about ECR, you can go to defendrojava.org or kind of any social media platform at Defend Rojava. But without further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce our awesome guest, Meghan Bodette. Um, and before I do that, I want to give people the chance to understand that we will have the opportunity later in the event to get some questions from the audience. So feel free, as Megan's speaking, to type questions that you would like to ask her into the chat. We will be screening those questions and we'll do our best to share as many as we can, address as many as we can by the end of the event. But please be patient to understand that we certainly won't have time to get to all of them. So we'll do our best to kind of get a broad section of them. But again, without further ado, let's introduce Megan and start talking about the situation in Kurdistan. Meghan Bodette is the Director of Research at the Kurdish Peace Institute. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University, where she concentrated in international law, institutions, and ethics. Her research focuses on Kurdish issues, with a focus on human rights, peace and democracy, women's rights, and Turkey's cross-border military operations in Iraqi Kurdistan and northern Syria. She has briefed officials from governments and international institutions on her findings and has been interviewed by national media, including NPR, and Now This, for her expertise. Megan, welcome to the event. Hope you're doing well in Kurdistan, especially with the recent developments in the last 24, 48 hours. We hope that you're safe and well. And to begin with, we'd like to ask you to give our audience a kind of initial general overview of the key developments that have taken place really since the fall of Assad last December to kind of set the context for today's conversation, understanding the major shifts taking place, especially in Syria and Turkey.
Well, thank you, Arthur, for that kind introduction, and to you, Debbie, and the whole team at ECR for putting this together and giving me the opportunity to speak. And of course, to everybody listening, I'd like to wish a belated Eid Mubarak to those who celebrated last weekend. I know I joined in on that tradition for the first time, and completely overstuffed myself with candy, visiting, houses of friends and relatives of friends. And of course, to anybody who might be calling in also from Kurdistan, Northeast Syria, or the region, I hope everybody is staying safe given the recent Israeli escalation and Iranian response that we've seen. So it's been a time of, era-defining change in the Kurdish issue and the wider Middle East this past year. To give a basic timeline of the events leading to today's regional context on the Kurdish issue, I think we can start by going back to March of 2024. that's when local elections were held in Turkey, following, a 5-year term. And in those local elections, the main opposition, Republican People's Party, or CHP, which is a Turkish nationalist sort of centrist party, overtook the right-wing Islamist AKP, the party of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey's ruling party, in the national vote share for the first time, as well as clinching the mayorships of key cities like Ankara and Istanbul for the second time. In that election, we also saw the pro-Kurdish Dem party win back many of the municipalities that were illegally seized by the state following the 2019 elections, and show that despite this pattern of state takeovers of municipalities and removals of pro-Kurdish mayors, that the pro-Kurdish voting base was still a force to be reckoned with in its strongholds in the southeast, and also as a force that could tip elections to the main opposition in major cities like Istanbul and Ankara, where many Kurds live. And we now know that just after those elections, reporting by Amber and Zaman and other journalists has confirmed that around that time in early 2024, the Turkish government, as it has done when it has felt it's been losing power in the past, turned to negotiations with the Kurdish movement again. Talks began between the government of Turkey and Abdullah Öcalan, founder and leader of the PKK, and between the government of Turkey and the Rojava, or Autonomous Administration, SDF leadership in Syria as well. The existence of those talks was first revealed in an October article for Al Monitor by Amber and Zaman. Following that October article, we saw Devlet Bahçeli, who's head of the ultra-nationalist Nationalist Action Party, or MHP, stand up in parliament and call on Abdullah Öcalan to address the Turkish parliament himself and declare an end to the PKK's armed campaign. Now, for an ultra-right nationalist leader, that was a huge shock, and that sort of set into motion the public process that we've seen of the government talking about negotiating with Öcalan, and the PKK and Öcalan himself being able to speak more openly about what they are asking for from the government. Now, just about a month and a half after the existence of these talks became public, the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad fell in the span of about 10 days after an assault by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, broke out of Idlib, where this Islamist group had been contained for a number of years, and led to the takeover of the Syrian state by HTS, which has now formed a transitional government. This again changed the dynamics on the Kurdish issue, because around the same time, Turkey-backed armed groups mobilized to attack the SDF and the Autonomous Administration in parts of northwestern Syria, including Shahba, where many refugees from the region of Afrin lived, and in Manbij, a mixed Arab-Kurdish region that had been under SDF control since it was liberated from ISIS in 2016. And there was a lot of fear at this time that Turkey and its proxy forces would use the fall of the Assad regime to completely destroy the Rojava project. But that ultimately wasn't what happened. The SDF and the people of northeast Syria put up a very strong resistance along the Euphrates River between Manbij and Kobani. And ultimately, as it was forced to take action against ISIS in 2014, the coalition and the international community were forced to take action once again and pressured Turkey into a ceasefire. Those lines have stayed about the same. Now, with the situation in northeast Syria calmed down, this allowed for a bit more movement on the peace process in Turkey. And I think developments in Syria also showed all sides of the negotiations in Turkey and northern Kurdistan the importance of moving forward. So in January and February of this year, the Dem party was able to hold meetings with Abdullah Öcalan in prison for the first time in several years. This broke the conditions of total isolation that Öcalan was under. And following several of those meetings, on February 27th of this year, Öcalan made a historic statement calling on the PKK to dissolve itself and end its armed campaign against the government of Turkey. This then led to many reactions from both Turkish and Kurdish politics, but also in terms of its impact on the situation in Syria, it allowed the SDF and the Syrian transitional government to come to an agreement to integrate Rojava, or North and East Syria, with the new Syrian state in some form. That agreement was reached on March 10th, about 2 weeks after Öcalan's statement. And the fact that Turkey allowed that to happen showed a sense of, if not full sincerity, then at least some level of seriousness about allowing these talks to move forward. So Syrian Kurds, after that March 10th agreement, and the whole North and East Syria system, because it's not, as you all, if you're listening to this, you know, only Kurds in that area, now got a seat at the table to participate in Syria's transition and bring in their ideas to challenge some of the more radical fundamentalist tendencies of the new state. Then in May, our next major development was the PKK's 12th Congress. After Öcalan made his statement, the PKK declared a ceasefire and their intent to implement Öcalan's call to dissolve themselves and end the conflict for good. Now, Turkey did not reciprocate that ceasefire, and for a while there was a lot of fear that that would lead to the deterioration of the process. But the PKK took the initiative, and at their 12th Party Congress, which was held in early May and which was announced on May 12th, they affirmed that they would end all organizational activities under the PKK name and end the armed struggle of the PKK, with the HPG and the YJ Star being their armed branches, that would come to an end as well. Now, this is a historic moment coming after 40 years. It's also left a lot of people asking questions about what the future of the Kurdish struggle is going to look like and how Kurds might achieve their goals in a context where this conflict is no longer going on and where armed resistance is no longer a tactic that is being used. And a lot of those questions remain unanswered. But what I'm going to try to do today is to explain where we are now in terms of what's going on in Northeast Syria as they attempt to integrate with a new Syrian government that is very unstable and comes from very concerning fundamentalist roots. We're going to talk about these questions of where the Kurdish movement goes in Turkey as they negotiate with the Turkish government and attempt to bring the conflict to an end. And we're going to talk about the wider regional crisis, how Kurdish actors are looking at it, and what opportunities there are for these movements to be able to, amidst all of these very difficult circumstances, continue to advance their ideas of bottom-up democracy, pluralism, the freedom of women, the rights of all ethnic and religious communities, and more. So from there, I think, Arthur, if you want to help break up those many topics into a few more digestible questions so I can go into detail, I'd love to hear what you have to ask.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Megan. I think that was a really great way to contextualize this conversation. As people are listening, I encourage people not to feel too overwhelmed. There's just a level of detail and depth to this topic that we never have enough time to get into. And even those of us who follow the situation on the ground and the movement in depth for years often struggle to keep up with it. So I think in the interest of, like you said, breaking this conversation up into more digestible chunks, I'd like to ask you to kind of dig in a little deeper to Syria specifically, right? So since the fall of Assad, of course, we have the new sort of transitional government in Damascus, headed up by al-Shara, formerly known as Jolani. And of course, you have, as you referenced, these ongoing negotiations between the forces aligned with the Syrian Democratic Forces, right? The movement in Rojava, and it's what we call the Democratic Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria. And on the other hand, the new government in Damascus. Uh, the way I'd like to frame the question is that I think we all understand that there's very strong ideological differences between those heading the new Syrian state and those running the autonomous administration, very contrasting visions for the future of governance in the country. But I'd like to ask you to talk about not only the ideological differences, but especially how are these negotiations coming down to practical questions of how laws will be implemented, who will exercise political rights, who will have cultural rights, right? The rights of women, questions of economy and defense. When it comes down to these practical questions, what are the details that are actually being negotiated in Damascus? And what do you see as the kind of primary tensions between these competing visions?
I think to start with an answer to that, I'm going to reference a sentiment that I heard quite a lot when I was just in Kamishlo in the autonomous Northeast this past week. Many Kurdish people and people in the Northeast view al-Shara and HTS's takeover of the Syrian state not as some kind of destruction of an old regime or regime change or revolution, but as something more like a military coup, wherein one armed faction seized control of the state apparatus from another armed faction, but kept the structure and essential character of the state intact. And they argue that because if you look at the transitional constitution that came out, you see, for example, that it's very similar to the Ba'athist era constitution. It's a highly centralized document. It gives a great deal of power to the central government and very little to local governments. It maintains only Arabic as an official language, even though communities in Syria speak Kurdish, Aramaic, Armenian, Turkmen, and many other languages. It says that Islam will be a source of legislation, which is a provision that was also in the previous constitution, even though many people who would do propaganda for the old regime would try to claim it as secular. That was never true. When Syria happens to be a very multi-religious country, and it keeps the name Syrian Arab Republic, although, again, Arabs are not the only people who live in Syria, and certainly there are many Arabs outside of Syria as well. So when we look at this very nationalist constitution, very centralized constitution, this constitution that attempts to impose just one identity on Syria, we see a setup of a state that's very similar to the old, very nationalist, very centralized Syrian state that the autonomous administration and the Kurdish movement set up their system as an alternative to in the first place. We also see that al-Shara and those close to him have been consolidating power around themselves. Now, one might argue that in a post-war situation like the one that the transitional government finds itself, it's important for leaders to be able to make decisions and prevent the state from collapsing back into conflict. And the transitional government is certainly in a very difficult situation. We can get into that a little bit later. But this has been something that many people have found concerning because for all the new government's rhetoric about how it wants to change the status quo in Syria and build a country that is better than the oppressive ultra-nationalist regime that it replaced, we're seeing this new state repeat many of the old state's patterns, which is the criticism that the Kurdish movement and the autonomous Northeast made of the Syrian state and really all nation states in the first place. Now, the way that many Syrian Kurds see it is that a real transition and a real change in Syria is going to happen when their region is integrated and some of these issues of decentralization, ethnic and religious pluralism, the rights of women, and other important issues of the autonomous project are discussed. The Syrian Kurdish position and the autonomous administration's position in negotiations right now is not a weak one at all. You know, HTS had enough armed force and enough political capacity to govern Idlib, which is a small, relatively ethnically homogenous province. Syria is a very large, very diverse country. The new Syrian government not only does not control all of Syria, as there are still the areas that are under the control of the SDF, And there are areas under the control of the Turkey-backed SNA that have in name been integrated, but de facto are still under Turkish control. Not only does the new government not control those territories, but friends of mine who've been to Damascus, both Kurdish and American, European, other international, say that even in areas under transitional government control, it's more like a patchwork of militias than a real state. The number of men under arms, under HTS command, under the transitional government's command, we should say, is smaller than the combined forces of the SDF and all of its associated groups. The SDF has in the autonomous administration, a older, more stable, and more cohesive government, and they have valuable relationships with the international community and aspects of their project, that have won acclaim for the stability they've created and the alternative that they've created to sort of ultra-nationalist, fundamentalist, sectarian governance. So they are bringing those strengths to the negotiating table. And when I speak to people who are knowledgeable about the negotiations, they believe that all sides are going to have to make compromises, but that the Northeast is in a position to really be able to preserve many of its gains, and where it can't preserve those gains, create ground where people can continue to fight. Now, one of these biggest ideological differences between the transitional government and the Northeast, and one of the issues at the table, as I mentioned, is decentralization. We know that as an Islamist fundamentalist group in origin and as the inheritor of the Syrian state structure, the transitional government has pursued a very centralized approach to how Syria ought to be run. While the whole philosophy of the Northeast is decentralization and bottom-up governance, and we've even seen in the past few years, real criticisms on the ground of the autonomous administration where people believe it's actually gotten too centralized and have asked for it to decentralize more. So on this one side, you have an already relatively decentralized system where the public is calling for even more decentralization and critiquing trends towards centralization. On the other side of negotiations, you have an ultra-centralized Islamist group that took over an ultra-centralized Arab nationalist state. So that's a real contradiction. But because of the structural weaknesses of the new government, and the sheer need for economic resources and manpower that it has in order to just govern, administer, and rebuild the territory that is within its hands, accepting some level of decentralization in the Northeast is likely going to be the most pragmatic outcome for this new state. We know there are examples of decentralization in Syrian history. Syria's first ever constitution in 1920 was a decentralized constitution. Obviously, of course, the European intervention ended up blocking that. But decentralization, unlike some people say, isn't something foreign or new in Syria or in the Middle East. There's practical examples of decentralization in the Northeast Syria system, particularly if you look at the early years from 2012 through 2014, with things like strong municipalities and the real bottom-up commune-based governance. That hasn't always worked as well as people wanted it to work, but there have been examples of in very organized communities where it does work very well. And then there have been experiences of decentralization in other parts of Syria. Communities all across Syria organize themselves to stand up to the regime and, keep basic day-to-day life going on under all sorts of different circumstances. So decentralization, I think, is more practical than people might believe that it would be. And the kind of decentralization that the Northeast is looking at is probably something to do with strong local government. We're looking at empowered municipalities with control over things like local internal security, education, public services. We're looking at, making sure that, not only is local security affiliated to the local government, but that it's made up of members of those communities, in a model that could look like just reflagging the existing internal security forces. And we're looking at, a level of political freedom in the Northeast where the sort of dual power model that the Kurdish movement has advanced very strongly in municipalities in northern Kurdistan and in Turkey could be replicated under maybe even more favorable conditions than Kurds in Turkey have. So on decentralization and local control of security, that's what people have been looking for, when based on my conversations. Then in terms of some of the, basic rights, as every negotiating delegation has been very clear about, they are not going to compromise on, the inclusion of Kurdish language as an official language, multilingualism, religious freedom and pluralism, for all religions in Syria. That's something that they're going to be very adamant about. Equality for women. If you look at photos of the two negotiating delegations and you see the Northeast Syria delegation, where you have women and men, Kurds, Christians, and Arabs, all different people of very different backgrounds sitting together. And then you see the Damascus delegation, and it's four bearded guys in suits. You can kind of see, even without any text or information about who these two sides are, the different visions that they represent. So these kinds of changes are something that they're going to be very strong in asking for. And look, fundamentally, Northeast Syria is an organized society. This is a system that was built up by people who were organizing under the Assad regime, 20, 30 years ago. And those people have long memories, and they have learned over all these years what works and what doesn't. And so whatever political system is made, whatever ideological differences and challenges and contradictions there are, whatever tactical steps back might have to be taken, that organized society is still there. They're putting pressure on their leaders to make sure that they get the kind of deal that they want to get. And they're ready to keep pushing forward. And to even potentially, in a peacetime situation, make progress on issues where the administration hasn't been able to implement some of its ideas as much. I know a lot of people are talking about really being able to focus on ecology more when the war isn't, such an everyday concern. People are talking about, as Syria is, able to get itself out from under sanctions, how to make sure that the economic recovery is done more equitably and to address some of the economic contradictions that weren't addressed during the conflict. So there's some hope too, in terms of what local governments will be able to do. And this is all very much an ongoing situation. Things can change over time, but that's about where things are based on what I've been hearing. And I put in the chat some documents, including the agreement between the transitional government and the SDF, so you can see sort of what the terms of that deal are on integration. And then the final document of the Kurdish Unity Conference held between the PYD, which is the main party of the autonomous administration, and the KNC, which is closer to the Iraqi Kurdish leadership. That unity document is kind of like a wish list of, the most maximalist position that Kurds would hope they'd get. So those are good resources if you're trying to understand who wants what and who's agreed to what.
Thank you so much, Megan. I know there's so much to cover with this, but I would like to ask you some quick follow-up questions before we move from Syria into kind of the topic of the situation with Turkey and the PKK. And so I'm going to name kind of like a few sort of concrete things. I'm wondering if you could give just like your best sense of the status of those things. So one of them is Turkey's role in pressuring Damascus and particularly the security situation. My understanding is that Turkey's attacks, which for anyone who's spent time in Rojava, is the reality of those attacks, the threat of those attacks, the drones overhead are just ubiquitous. My understanding is that there's been a real measurable de-escalation. So if you could give some updates on that. Also, this question of the region of Afrin and the return of the Kurdish people to Afrin. I know for people in Rojava looms really large. And I spent time in Sheba Canton with people who had been displaced from Afrin in 2018. Very heartbreaking to see them displaced from Sheba in December of last year. What is your sense of the status of this, not just of Afrin, but the larger question of Turkish occupation and Turkish attacks?
Of course, thank you so much for asking. I will say that the reports that we've been hearing, to my experience on the ground, have been true. There have been very few, perhaps one or two Turkish drone strikes in the entire span of time since the March 10th agreement was put into place. There's a marked improvement in security conditions. This is something I've heard from civilian populations. This is also something I've heard from people, working with the local administration themselves. And I've seen even, in people's actual behavior in real life, local officials who used to be afraid to go out and meet with their constituents out of the fear that they might be targeted because of their work with the administration or the SDF, now moving around more freely, engaging with their constituencies more freely. And that's a real sign of improvements because we know how cautious populations there are about their security. And certainly anyone who spent time there knows how cautious anybody who's affiliated with an institution is obligated to be about their security. So the security improvements are real. There is, as Syrian Kurdish leaders have said, a de facto ceasefire, and everyone is hoping that that will be solidified into something more permanent. Now, Turkey still does hold a lot of influence. They have, of course, the implicit threat to invade at any time just due to their military strength. They're also putting a lot of pressure on Damascus to not accept Kurdish demands. While you obviously have these highly centralized tendencies from the Syrian transitional government, it's important to recognize that the Syrian transitional government is a very pragmatic entity. They understand that it's in their rational interest not to fight the SDF. But Turkey has exerted some of its influence in order to make it more difficult for the new government to accept Kurdish demands. I've heard from people involved in negotiations that government officials have said that they would have no problem, making some of these changes that the Northeast would like to see. It's simply the fact that Turkey refuses to accept it that is the holdup. So there still are challenges to the security situation caused by Turkey, but it's nowhere near as bad as it used to be. There's real improvement on the ground. As for the status of Afrin, I want to start by sharing in the chat a recent CNN investigation into some of the Turkey-backed Syrian National Army militias that were ruling occupied Afrin for the past 7 years and their abuses, particularly against Kurdish women. This is a very difficult investigation to read. Obviously, it talks about war crimes, torture, kidnapping, and sexual and gender-based violence. So if you don't want to read that, be warned. But I think that we all have to share and raise awareness of what has been going on in Afrin these past 7 years to lift up the extremely courageous survivors who testify in that report, and to make sure that people know what these Turkey-backed groups have been doing, because as part of their response to their lack of state capacity and sort of vulnerability to Turkish pressure, Syria's new government has been integrating these SNA militias that are infamous for crimes in places like Afrin into the new Syrian army. So groups like the Hamza Division, the Sultan Suleiman Shah Division, and Ahrar al-Sharqiya, which are under US sanctions and now new EU sanctions for violence against Kurds, Yazidis, women, and other groups, are now being given senior military positions in the new Syrian state. That's a huge matter for concern for people on the ground. People simply do not accept that these individuals will be part of their army. You hear a lot of comments to the extent of, if they ever actually try to set foot in the Northeast, that it might not go so well for them. And look, this is an extremely organized society where everyone has military training. I believe that. So this could be a real source of instability if these people are kept in their positions. But we've seen that the new state is susceptible to international and public pressure. They've backed down on some of their more controversial decisions, as they did recently with an order, mandating more conservative swimwear at public beaches. That lasted a day. Then they went and said, no, we're not going to tell you what you can and can't wear to the beach. We've also seen again that they're pragmatic and that they don't want to pick a fight with the Syrian Kurds. So I think keeping the pressure up and awareness raised on the fact that these groups are a liability, not an asset for a strong, stable government, is something important that we can do. And so in terms of the status of Afrin, for these populations to return, one thing that has to happen is they have to know that they can return without being targeted by Turkey or Turkish-backed militias. We've seen some of the militias starting to withdraw from Afrin, though we haven't seen a Turkish withdrawal. We've also seen the populations moved into Afrin to Turkey by Turkey in order to change its demographics, returning to the parts of Syria where they are actually from. These includes relatives of militia members and just displaced people who Turkey moved around. Sometimes actually refugees who were illegally deported from Turkey into Afrin, even though they're not from Afrin, that's not their home, in violation of international law. So, because of some of these changes, some people have started to return to check on their homes and properties. They're seeing a lot of devastation, but they're able to go back for the first time. This is something that people are really happy about. But people need to see a real sense of security in order to permanently move back into Afrin. This is going to be one of the main topics for the Autonomous Administration and Syrian Transitional Government negotiating delegations. My understanding is that the kind of agreement that the communities are hoping for is something where the militias are out, Turkey is out, local communities can go back, and some combination of perhaps transitional government security forces and Kurdish internal security forces, like the joint checkpoints that we're seeing in the Kurdish neighborhoods of Sheikh Maksud in Aleppo. A deal like that could prove reasonable for both sides. So that's being worked out right now. I can also share in the chat something that Aras Youssef, who's our research associate at our office in Kamishlo, who's from Afrin herself, wrote, outlining kind of what the displaced communities of the occupied areas want to see. But yeah, that's about how that's going. There's real security challenges, but there's also real movement towards improvements, both in Afrin and in northeast Syria proper.
Thank you so much, Megan. Appreciate you touching on those topics. I think with the time that we have before we do pivot to taking some more audience questions, I'd like to make sure we have time to talk, especially about developments between the PKK or former PKK and the Turkish state. So as we pivot to that, I'm wondering if you can speak more to the particular conditions that are unfolding right now. What is the status of these political negotiations taking place between the Kurdistan Workers' Party and the Turkish state? Um, how has this impacted the level of political repression in Bakur, for example, in Kurdish communities in Southeast Turkey? Um, what changes have taken place in the conditions of Abdullah Öcalan's imprisonment, for example? And what are the developments in civil society that you see moving forward if these negotiations can move uh, the conflict from a war to a political struggle? What kind of organizing forms do you think, what kind of sh political shapes will the movement take in Southeast Turkey that have not otherwise been the case since maybe going back to, 2013, 2014?
Yeah, of course. I think to start, as I mentioned when I went over this, and as you'll know if you've been following the issue, the main steps that have been taken so far have been from the Kurdish side. So I shared in the chat Abdullah Öcalan's February 27th declaration, where he called on the PKK to renounce the tactic of armed struggle and to dissolve itself. And then I also shared the PKK's 12th Party Congress statement, where they announced that that would be exactly what they would do going forward. And I think it's important for anybody involved in the solidarity community, anybody involved in following this in an academic context, really anyone who wants to understand this, to know that this is a strategy, right? The Kurdish movement is trying to not only negotiate with the Turkish state, but to do so in a way that the very polarized, very propagandized Turkish society does not react to with such, opposition and force that the government is then unable to make such a deal. Remember, they're dealing with a society, that Erdogan has pushed into this, pro-war frenzy, this anti-Kurdish sort of ultra-nationalist tendency. Not that it didn't exist before the past 10 years, but particularly since the government abandoned the peace talks, it really built itself up and, expanded its authoritarian crackdown on this anti-Kurdish pro-war sentiment. So the movement is being very strategic in how it tries to disarm that as it moves forward. So the steps that it has taken and the concessions that it has made have been very loud and very public, whereas concessions like, for example, Turkey's acquiescence to a ceasefire in northeast Syria is something you wouldn't know about really unless you were there yourself, seeing the actual stoppage of the cross-border strikes, for example. So this is an intentional strategy by the movement. I think another important thing to bring up is that nothing that Öcalan really said here, and even nothing that the PKK has done, is new in this movement's history. Öcalan has been talking about resolving the Kurdish question based on democratization and improved Turkish-Kurdish relations within Turkey's borders since he declared the PKK's first ceasefire ever in 1993. And the PKK actually has dissolved itself once before in 2002, following Öcalan's capture. He called on the movement to dissolve itself. They did. And of course, developments didn't go in such a way that that could be a permanent decision. They ended up reconstituting and then, of course, rearming and ending a ceasefire in June of, I believe, 2004. But this is something that they've done before. This is something that they've been trying to do to get the conflict to a point where it doesn't have to be an armed conflict and where it can be resolved at the negotiating table. That's been the entire goal of the war that they've been waging, since the mid to late 1990s, when it became apparent that they weren't going to win a military victory over the state of Turkey. The war has existed to create political leverage and also to ensure that Kurdish communities would have an armed force to protect them in the case of, for example, something like ISIS in northeast Syria. So obviously, during the last peace process, disarmament wasn't an option because you still had that ISIS threat. But now the SDF exists and they're negotiating to be part of the new system in Syria. You have a very different regional context. So it's important to remember that these big public concessions are a strategy and they're also not new. The movement knows what it's doing and Öcalan knows what he's doing as well. We've seen improvements in Öcalan's conditions, which is a key demand of the Kurdish movement as well. That's another Turkish concession that is very real but hasn't been expressed so publicly. Öcalan has now been able to meet with Dem Party delegations. If you believe what the rumors among Kurdish communities are saying, he's had many more meetings than have actually been publicized with many more people than are known to have met him. It was also recently announced by his legal team that 3 more prisoners were moved to Imrali Island, which is the maximum security prison where he's held. These are all PKK prisoners, who have done writing and other intellectual and theoretical work in prison. And the idea is that they're probably there to help him work on the peace process, as some sort of staff or team, so to speak. So that's a real change. I think now the Kurdish movement is expecting the government of Turkey to take some steps and really make changes on issues like, for example, political prisoners in Turkey, the issue of municipalities that have been taken over by the state. And I think given the regional context now, Turkey has been always very concerned about escalation between Israel and Iran and the prospects that such a conflict could create opportunities that Kurds could take advantage of. We've seen in Iraq and in Syria that when there's been regional upheaval, and Kurds have been able to defend themselves and organize themselves, they've been able to make a place for themselves out of that type of conflict. Turkey is very afraid that a regional Iran-Israel conflict could give Kurds in Iran new opportunities and could also make, both sides of that conflict more inclined to have an interest in using Kurds in Turkey against the Turkish government. So they're trying to, with this peace process, sort of get the Kurdish community on side, so to speak, before that kind of conflict happens. And now, unfortunately, we're seeing that there has been this massive Israeli escalation, that Iran has responded. Israel's probably going to respond. Iran's probably going to respond again. The risk of escalation is very real. And Devlet Bahçeli, the far right leader to just today, said that he believes the real target of this war is Turkey. Now, we don't know how true that is, but it's important that Bahçeli believes that. Um, so I think the government might be under even more pressure to take steps on the peace process soon. And before this escalation, it already was facing that pressure. We've seen leaders from the Kurdish movement saying that they can't do everything alone, right? This has to be a two-sided process. So that's about where we are on the negotiations. The kind of next steps would have to be things like release of political prisoners, the return of pro-Kurdish municipalities. There's been a parliamentary commission established to look into, I think, some of the legal changes. Erdogan has also announced a committee to draft a potential new constitution. But the parliament's about to go on break, I believe, later this week or early next week, which might delay some of this until it reopens in the fall. And of course, the regional situation is very unpredictable. But that is about where negotiations are. And in terms of new political formations, I think we're going to see a lot of, more, I guess, unrestricted community level organizing. Something like the Dem Party is probably still going to exist at the parliamentary level and the municipal level. Hopefully, it will exist with its imprisoned members free and without the threat of state takeovers of local government and removals of members of parliament. But I think in terms of new forms of organization, what we'll probably see is stronger and less repressed, more dedicated local level community social organizing. This is very close to the Kurdish movement's, traditional model. This is what they've always done, is forming these communes and building these very deep relationships, visiting families and talking to them for hours about what their problems are and how they can solve them. I think if you look at what Öcalan has been saying and you look at what kind of de facto semi-autonomy in municipalities looked like during the peace process, that's where this is headed. And that is a solution that it looks like could be acceptable to all parties.
Thank you so much. Again, a lot to cover, but that's a really helpful kind of overview, I think. And it sounds like, if I may kind of sum up what you're saying, the ball's really in Turkey's court in this moment.
Yes.
There's been a lot of unilateral action from the Kurdish movement, but it's yet to be seen kind of to what extent Turkey's really willing to um, create the conditions for that organizing that you're describing to take place. Um, before we transition to audience questions, you very quickly you mentioned this escalating war between Israel and Iran and how this is starting to influence kind of like political projections for the future, including with Turkey. I'm wondering if you could just very quickly speak to the sort of less often discussed wing of the Kurdish freedom movement that exists in Rojava in eastern Kurdistan and which is of course northwest Iran. Um, Very quickly after the PKK made their announcement that they had held their 12th Congress and they voted to dissolve and disarm, there was a statement from PJAK, the Kurdish party aligned with the PKK, clarifying that it had no intentions to disarm or dissolve itself, that it was an autonomous manifestation of Kurdish aspirations and self-determination and self-defense within Eastern Kurdistan. I'm wondering if you could speak to activity within PJAK in this moment and what you see as sort of opportunities or priorities for the Kurdish freedom movement in East Kurdistan in the context of this evolving conflict in Iran.
Yeah, definitely. I think first I'll start by sharing with the chat what Pijak said just today about the escalating conflict. In summary, they have condemned the Iranian regime's treatment of its Kurdish population. They have condemned the Israeli regime's attacks on civilian populations. They've said that war is not the answer, but that if you want to look at the cause of war in the region, it's these ultra nationalist religious fundamentalist, ethnic fundamentalist states, that, as the Kurdish movement's paradigm has always criticized, will only ever be able to cause problems and cause conflict and cause destabilization. So their view there is that this is the sort of inevitable end result of the system of nation states in the region that exists. And that in that context, Kurds have to protect themselves by organizing themselves and by being prepared to defend and govern themselves, in the event of instability, conflict, or circumstances where they have to protect themselves against these attacks. Now, this is very similar to statements made by other Kurdish parties in Iran, which have also, condemned the Iranian state for its repressive treatment of Kurdish populations, of women, of the working class, and which have also made the point that Kurdish communities have to be able to defend and govern themselves in order to be protected from these regional crises and conflicts. A couple things that are important to note in the Iranian Kurdish context is that the Kurdish parties in Rojava, the Kurdish region of Iran, don't tend to have as harsh divisions between them, or as little, as much difficulty in cooperating as Kurdish parties have had in other regions. They all have very similar positions. So the PJAK, the PDKI, the Komala, all of these parties support a federal Iran with a region for the Kurdish community within, one united federal state, a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, secular system with, of course, rights for women. We saw during the Xinjiang Azadi uprising in 2022 that they worked together to coordinate actions like general strikes. So these parties have similar goals and a capacity for working together. What's important about PJAK is that it is the only main Iranian Kurdish party that has not disarmed. So some of the older, more established Iranian Kurdish parties were, through a process a couple of years ago, disarmed and sort of moved into camps in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And that does not mean that they could not rearm themselves in the event of the Kurdish community in Iran, in East Kurdistan, needing protection. But that does mean that they're in a bit of a different situation. It's also important for us to remember that some of the dynamics between Turkey, Iran, and the Kurdish movement are very different in the context of this peace process. There had been in the past some constraints on what PJAK could do because the wider movement needed to not antagonize Iran in order to not make another enemy in Syria, for example, when Assad's state was still in power, in order to essentially not have to fight a two-front war against Turkey and Iran at the same time. Now, of course, Assad is out, Iran is a non-entity in Syria, and negotiations with Turkey are moving forward. So you could have more freedom of action against the Iranian state than you might have been able to have 10 years ago. At the same time, there's sort of two different options for how this might impact Turkey and how Turkey might approach this. If peace talks move forward, you could have a situation where Turkey could be on reasonably positive terms with the Kurdish movement in Iran, enough to not completely intervene and threaten their project. On the other hand, the possibility of Iranian Kurdish gains and some kind of autonomous system in Rojava, due to increased conflict and decreasing Iranian state capacity, really puts pressure on Turkey. As I mentioned, Devlet Bahçeli thinks this whole Israel-Iran war is actually about Turkey, and could push Turkey to, move closer to making agreements with the Kurds, within Turkey as well. So there's a variety of different dynamics here, all very much interrelated to each other within Turkey and within Syria. And this is still the very early days of whatever is going to happen. I think we should all look at Syria, right? We should look at how the Kurdish position developed there. When things began, it was not clear at all which direction the situation would go. But what the Kurdish movement had was the fact that it was organized, and that it was willing to defend people if it had to govern itself if it had to, but not to provoke the situation or pick fights with either the state or the opposition until such time as those forces might attack them. And I think especially after the Syrian Kurdish experience and then the failures of the war for autonomy in the cities in northern Kurdistan in 2015 and 2016, the movement and all Kurdish parties in Iran are going to be playing this very carefully. But from what I understand, from people who know what's going on the ground over there, this community is organized. This community is ready to do what has to be done. They're waiting for the moment in time when they will have to, and they're ready to protect themselves. I think it's also optimistically so far, we haven't seen in these early days that Syria and Iraq will be the kind of battlegrounds that they were between Iran and Israel, before Iran's influence in particularly Syria was kind of diminished by the fall of the regime. And of course, we don't want this war to happen anywhere. But for Northeast Syria and Iraqi Kurdistan, people don't seem as nervous as they've been in previous rounds of clashes. So that's positive as well. It's very early to determine where this is all going to go, but I think those are kind of the main things to keep in mind.
Super fascinating to consider the possibilities of that one possible path is that the Iranian state is weakened so much and the larger geopolitical situation changes such that possibly there could be democratic confederalist civil society organizing in Rojava, something that those following this movement don't spend as much time kind of considering. I think it's time to transition to questions from the audience. I want to encourage everybody to write their questions in the chat. We have a few so far, and I want to just start with one that is from Ian. And the question is to Megan, can you speak more about your belief that the agreement with the Syrian state is increasingly looking like it might put the DAANES in a position more similar to that described in democratic autonomy in northern Kurdistan? This is a reference to a book about civil society organizing in Southeast Turkey and Kurdish communities in the early 2010s, of course.
Yeah, of course. I think first, there's a PDF of that book free online. It's definitely good to read, whatever your interest in this movement is. And certainly, if your interest is in such the capacity that you're looking for lessons you can learn from what the Kurdish community and the Kurdish movement has been doing that could be implemented in contexts that might look more like our own in the United States. So it's a great book. Everyone should check it out. I think that is a model that we should be looking at because of the focus that it puts on strong local government. Now, in the sort of more authoritarian nationalist political cultures of the region, there's a kind of fear of concepts like federalism and autonomy. When you have regimes like Assad's regime, like Ba'athist Iraq, like the very nationalist state in Turkey, constantly sort of inundating the population with propaganda about how there are all of these outside plots to disintegrate their countries and refusing to allow populations to know about the real ethnic and religious diversity of those states and using different ethnic and religious groups against each other, it becomes almost inevitable that many people are going to fear that these sort of very institutionalized forms of decentralization, particularly if they appear to benefit, any given ethnic or religious group, might lead to the dissolution of those states. And that kind of propaganda is very, very difficult to undo. It's not something rational. It's the impact of, this kind of very statist, very authoritarian rule that has unfortunately been imposed on this region. So one thing that doesn't set off that sort of fear is the concept of local government, right? Municipal government. And we know that in northern Kurdistan and in Turkey, the Kurdish movement has been extremely successful in using the rather limited institutions of, quote unquote democracy that exist in the Turkish context, doubling that up with a very strong level of, sort of extra legal, extra state, social organization, and putting these models together to have, a kind of dual power system where, the pro-Kurdish parties are winning huge majorities in the municipalities. They have the mayorships, they have the municipal councils, but they also might then use their community organizing power to organize something like a women's council or a council of different religions or something like this. Um, so I think that that is relevant to what we might see happen in northeast Syria, because if the Syrian state isn't going to accept federalism or autonomy right away, it might accept strong local government, right? It might give a large number of powers to municipalities that around the world municipalities don't generally have. And we know that the Kurdish community in northeast Syria is like the Kurdish community in North Kurdistan and in Turkey, very organized, kind of used to this political model. And this is what people in the Northeast have really been asking for, to the point where in the past couple of years, I know we did an event on the new social contract in, I think, early 2024. One of the big changes in that social contract was it actually started to break up some of the power that had been centralized in the autonomous administration and give more decision-making power and fiscal power back to the municipalities. When the administration was founded, not to do a whole history lesson here, you didn't have the autonomous administration of northeast Syria. You had an administration in Afrin, in Kobani, and in Jazeera. And even before that was done, you had the PYD and the commune system slowly taking over positions inside existing Syrian regime municipalities. There's a great story that one of the local organizers who was in Kamishlo at the time tells about how they started by doing municipal trash pickup when Assad's people wouldn't do it anymore. And then they put a flyer in bread bags. They went to the state-owned bakeries, and because every house didn't have a TV or the internet, but every house did get bread. And so every bag of bread had a flyer that said, hey, see how your trash is being picked up now? That's us. That's the PYD. We're doing that. The regime is not doing that for you. So this sort of municipal organizing was kind of where they came from. It got weakened, unfortunately, during the war. And we saw in these past few years efforts to kind of move back towards it. And I think finding that as a solution that they've got experience with, both in northeast Syria and the wider Kurdish movement, could be valuable in the sense that it could kind of satisfy everyone's interests at the same time, and give the sort of civil society, community level aspect of the movement, the grassroots level aspect of the movement, room to thrive and organize and rebuild revolutionary enthusiasm in ways that it kind of hasn't had in a while.
Thanks so much, Megan. We have some other questions. One from Tom. The Civil War created upheaval and disruption, opening up a political space for something new to take root. Abdullah Öcalan's writings laid out a political structure and principles and inspired activists. But what got a critical mass of ordinary people to sign up to a plan so unlike anything they had ever known before? Great question.
That is a great question. And I would say a couple of things. One, certainly the Kurdish national interest, right? In any place where you have an oppressed or occupied people, people are going to want to resist. And so even for many Kurds who didn't necessarily agree with the politics of the movement at first, this sort of basic desire for self-determination was hugely motivating. And so this is a lesson that can be kind of taken to anywhere where you have a group that might be an ethnic group, might be a religious group, might be the working class, might be women. If you have a broad concern that impacts a large enough number of people, if you're addressing their kind of basic issue, if you're addressing the injustice that they're facing, they don't have to be 100% on board with your politics today. They might get there once they see that you're trying to solve their problem. And so I think that that's something that is certainly a universal political lesson that was a huge part of how they were able to do that. The second part is they did the work of organizing. One thing that I didn't really appreciate until I had spent a little bit more time in the region and, got to a fluent level with my Kurmanji was the way that the sort of professional revolutionaries of the Kurdish movement would literally go house by house and street by street and meet with as many of their constituents as they could. And if you were a, Kurdish family that was involved in the movement, you could expect this kind of direct face-to-face engagement with your, political leaders, political representatives on a very regular basis. When Abdullah Öcalan was in Syria, for a time he was in Damascus. He spent many years kind of in this sort of more separated area. But there's also countless meetings that he held with Syrian Kurdish communities. People would go from northeast Syria to Damascus or to the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon to meet with him, to hear from him, and then he would also hear from them. When the PKK cadres who first came to northeast Syria were organizing, they weren't off on military bases that they set up for themselves or, hidden in underground tunnels or whatever. They were in people's homes. They were living in the community. And this kind of extremely localized, extremely personalized relationship building level of organizing meant that people could trust the movement and that the movement knew what the people wanted and how to implement them. It was also a form of democratic accountability in an environment where you really couldn't have an election, right? Because if you're an underground political movement, you're not holding municipal elections or something like that. It's just not something you're capable of doing. But if as a representative of a movement, that if you make your constituents upset, you're going to have to sit down with them for dinner and hear about it, you're going to be doing what they want, right? And if you as a constituent know, like, okay, I don't like this decision, but I get to see Haval so-and-so on Thursday, and I'm really going to let him have it, then, again, that's a direct form of democratic accountability. So I think being close to the community that you're trying to organize and really making sure that they know that you're there for them, that's also something that allowed, so many people to be able to do this because so many people were organized into this system. And then third, I think really having a role for everyone. When a lot of people think about revolution, they think about the people on the front line doing the fighting. And that's obviously in a situation like Northeast Syria, unfortunately, that was important. There were serious threats from the regime, from ISIS and from Turkey that required military action for communities to be able to defend themselves. But fighting is not the only role in a revolution. You meet older women who are active community organizers, who have been for their entire lives. You've seen their children and now their grandchildren, organize in the same structures that they do. You have all of the work of building, every different kind of community institution and governing institution. So, if you were someone who knew economics, that could be your role. If you were an agricultural engineer, guess what? They needed those. If you could teach, congratulations, you're teaching in a school, right? All of the different skills that a person might have, this movement, found a way to use them. It organized in so many different areas and set up so many different things that it wasn't just something that was only asking for people who could fight or people who could protest. And then at the same time, it made sure that the members of its society had a level of political understanding and a level of, basic practical skill that people did kind of have the basis that if they did have to go fight or they did have to go protest, they would know what they were doing. In January when I was over there, I was staying with a friend of mine and her family and her, older, middle-aged to older parents, this nice older Kurdish couple, were talking about how they were going to go to their neighborhood civil defense training because that's just what everybody does. Because unfortunately, in that situation, maybe you have to. And so the movement made it so that every person who needed ideological understanding or practical skills would have the ability to get it if they wanted. again, the system is not perfect. Not everyone is like, yeah, let's go to civil defense training. Let's read books while there's a war going on. But you know what? A lot of people are. And it is, if you don't show people how to do things and you don't accommodate the skills they have, they're not going to want to help you and they're going to bring those skills elsewhere. So those are, I think, a little bit of the explanation of how they were able to do it. And those aren't just lessons that are only applicable to Kurds or to Syria. I think they're kind of applicable to getting a large number of people to do anything anywhere in the world.
These are fantastic lessons, not just for understanding the Kurdish movement, but strategic lessons for any kind of political organizing. I think they're kind of universal lessons. Thanks, Megan. Um, we're winding down on time. I'd like to read a question from Kevin. If the active kinetic conflict between Israel/US and Iran leads to a consolidation of the Ayatollah IRGC's political power, therefore leading to more intense repression, what is the plan? Assuming that's
Well,
asking, what is the Kurdish movement's plan to like react to?
yeah. I mean, I think in that situation, they are ready to defend themselves if attacked. We've already seen an increasing level of repression following the 2022 protests, and that has not really deterred Kurdish organizing. We see everything from, civil society campaigns, against the horrific treatment of prisoners, against the death penalty, against all of these abuses, to an increasing number of young Kurdish men and women joining Kurdish opposition groups. There was a lot of reporting during the uprising about Kurdish people who, after participating in protests and realizing, that they might be threatened by the state, that they went to the mountains to join, some of the different Kurdish opposition parties. So there's been already implemented a plan to deal with increasing repression. And I think that the type of conflict that would be likely to arise if this conflict between, Iran and then Israel, backed by the United States, is to escalate. Iran and Israel have the capacity to inflict a very significant amount of damage on each other. If we look at what we've seen in these opening strikes, these are well-armed, regional powers that are willing to use a great deal of force, very indiscriminately, to say the least. And so I think it's unlikely that we'd be talking about a conflict that would leave the Iranian state stronger. I think the threats would come not from a more consolidated state, but from the kind of dangers of weak states, like we saw in Syria. There might be, factions in an opposition or in some kind of reconstituted Iranian state that are just as hostile to Kurdish demands as the current state is. For example, there's this monarchist faction that's very Persian nationalist, similar to how much of the Syrian opposition couldn't let go of the kind of Arab nationalism that the regime represented. That could be a real threat. We also know that the type of opposition that Israel would like to see in Iran is this sort of hardline Persian nationalist monarchist type opposition. So that could be a threat there. But I don't see this leading to increased state capacity really in any way, just given the trajectory that the state has been on and the kind of war that these powers would be willing and able to wage against each other.
Thank you so much, Megan. We're going to have to move towards kind of wrapping up today's conversation. And I would like to, before we do that, interject actually one more quick question because I think it's really important that we have the chance just to super briefly touch on the role of the United States, especially under Trump, both in terms of the projected drawdown of US troops, but as well as this news around the lifting of economic sanctions on Syria as a whole. So, if you could briefly just touch on these topics, we can, of course, refer people to where they can, follow up and read more information. But what is the latest news on the US's military and economic policy towards Syria and its impacts before we wrap up for the day.
Yeah, so in terms of military policy, the US has been very clear that there's going to be a drawdown. They're going to attempt to formalize some sort of relationship where they're able to keep, I think, at least some of their presence. And reporting from Al Monitor has suggested that this could be the sort of big coalition base in Hasaka, that if you've been there, you know about and have probably seen. And in the event that the SDF is a part of the new Syrian army, which is what both sides are negotiating towards right now, you could have some situation where that looks very similar to the existing US SDF presence there. But there's going to be a drawdown, hopefully. Of course, all bets could be off if this conflict in the region escalates. But the Trump administration has been very clear that that is the policy that it would like to pursue. In terms of economic policy, Trump said he was going to lift all sanctions. There have been some people who've been trying to mess with that in Washington, but it looks like the White House has been moving ahead and Congress has been, taking the kind of legislative action that they would want to take. And that is, I think, one thing that you would see people who supported the former state, people who supported the new state, and people who support the Northeast all agree on is that these sanctions were just crushing Syrian people, right? Whether you were in regime areas, opposition areas, SDF areas, Kurdish, Arab, Christian, whatever, these sanctions were harming the Syrian public. And Assad and his regime just turned to, criminal enterprises to fund themselves. So the sanctions had to go, and now they're going to be gone. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. And I think sanctions relief is something, excuse me, that's going to be good for everyone and something that we can take advantage of too. Hire local researchers, journalists, remote workers who can contribute to prospects online, go over there, visit. Like, helping people rebuild is something that we can all play a part in, and especially helping them rebuild in a sustainable way that builds the kind of equitable society that we want. People with expertise in that. Now's the time. So that would be what I can say on that. And I see we're at 1 minute after 9:30. So thank you so much for this great discussion. Thank you everyone for your great questions. You know where to find me, and you know where to find ECR.
Thank you so much, Megan. I think that is a great place to start wrapping up the talk. We really appreciate your time and appreciate you making a little extra space to touch on the U.S. role, because I think it is so important. We as ECR, we're obviously based in the United States, and constantly aware of the outsized role that the United States plays, right or wrong, in influencing outcomes in the region. So we think it's especially important people understand um, the power that the U.S. has to influence what happens on the ground in Syria, not only militarily, and economically. Again, as you mentioned, we're all hoping that this sanctions relief could make it easier to materially support communities in Northeast Syria. But also politically, no, I just shared a link in the chat of a recent press release we put out, trying to give a boost to an op-ed that official of the Autonomous Administration, Ilham Ahmed, wrote in the New York Times, really directly calling on the United States to support the Kurdish movement's demand for decentralization. Because, of course, as the U.S. is doing things like lifting sanctions, they're in a position to give to put pressure on the new government in Damascus. And it's important that we all kind of understand that possibility is there. There were some questions in the chat. Obviously, we didn't have time to get to all of them, so I want to apologize to anybody whose questions we didn't get to. We appreciate you participating, nonetheless. Some of the questions were kind of direct about things like how can we keep up with developments, and what is the role of the solidarity movement? So just to very briefly address those things, I think following ECR is a great way to do that. The Emergency Committee for Rojava, our website is defendrojava.org. You can also follow us on social media, pretty much anywhere at Defend Rojava. But also, Meghan works with an incredible organization called the Kurdish Peace Institute. We've left a link to their website in the chat too. I believe it is just kurdishpeace.org. You can also find some of Meghan's articles there, which I highly recommend, especially her recent piece called Why Syria's Kurds Want Federalism. Um, and furthermore, we as ECR, we sometimes try to do grassroots activism, advocacy around this issue, pushing for policy changes that could support the Kurdish freedom movement, could make life for communities in northeast Syria a little bit easier, bring political, economic relief, etc. So that's yet another reason to please follow up with us at defendrojava.org. Be sure to sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already done so. But again, Meghan, really want to thank you from the bottom of our heart for taking time out of your busy life right now to join us on this call. We wish you the best in your travels and your work. And we hope that you're staying safe there in northern Iraq as the situation unfolds with the conflict in Iran. But without further ado, I think we'll just go ahead and wrap it up for the day and say thank you all so much. If you're heading out to any events today, stay safe. All right. Take care, y'all. Solidarity. Oh, and we've recorded this event. We'll be sure to post it onto our channels just so you all know. So keep an eye out on our social media. We'll be sure to put it on our YouTube channel. So thanks again, everyone. You can always email us at info@defendrojava.org if you have any other follow-up questions. Thank you.